he's working on seals, sea lions, and whales. I'm very, very interested in interaction between marine mammals of all stripes and types. Please come forward. There are seats here to sit down. Sitting is good. They're good for you. Marine mammals and fisheries. So I would also say that Andrew is a person who is not afraid to ask controversial questions in provocative ways, and has even been known on one or two rare occasions to mix it up across the science industry, some would say divide. In terms of his academic record, he's got about a gazillion publications. You can go through page after page after page after page after page of his resume until you want to just quit, because he has so many more than you do. Yes. Okay. But other than that, after I finished being depressed and read on, he also has spent a lot of time trying to communicate with the public, from really small groups of people in very local communities, trying to work with them on what's going on with marine mammals and fisheries in their communities, to very, very big, broad public audiences. And I was reading an excerpt from an interview he did for the PBS series Nature, titled The Mystery in Alaska. And it goes on, and Andrew's talking about the various theories that people have about Steller sea lions, and what's causing declines, and is it commercial fisheries, or is it climate change, all of these things, is it the change in food, and no doubt he will speak to us about that today. It's a very well done interview, so if you haven't seen it, you should at least read it online. But when you get to the end, there is a reply from a reader, the way you can do now on the web, so you can type in your feelings right away after reading this. And the first quote, right after it was posted, was, quote, "I love it. I think this makes me want to become a zoologist when I grow up. I am only 10 years old right now." And so Andrew is actually getting to a really wide range of folks. And as the students in the 7th grad class note, unlike many people we know, if you give to 10-year-olds, he can change the world. So without further ado, I give you a man who can change the world.
Well, thank you, Julie, for that very kind and generous introduction. What I'm going to be, is that too loud, or I can hear myself? What I'm going to be talking to you about is really this question about whether or not fisheries, in this case groundfish fisheries in Alaska and sea lions, can coexist. And this has been a multi-million-dollar question. And well, I'm going to take you down the path of discovery that I've made over the past 19 years since I first started on this. And believe me, I thought it would only take me a year to solve it when I started. I'm not sure, even though I'll point out today how much more we know, I do want to point out that there is, in fact, no consensus. The sea lion community is probably just as divided today as it was 19 years ago. Well, to answer this question, you need to look and get a little bit of background information to sort of put it into context. And I think probably about the only thing that everybody who works in sea lions would agree with is the fact that there's an awful lot of sea lions missing. There's no argument about that. And in many ways, it almost reads like a murder mystery, like a novel, because like in any good mystery, yes, we have somebody who's missing, but we also have a person of interest. And again, the sea lion community is unified in guess who? Looking at the commercial fishermen as being the most likely suspect in this crime. So let me show you a little bit of biology here to see whether we can link the two together. For starters, Steller sea lions breed only in the North Pacific Ocean. I'm showing you here their breeding sites starting in California and going across the Aleutian Islands to Kamchatka and then down to northern Japan. And genetically, In the United States, there are two populations recognized, referred to as stocks, the eastern and western stock. And they appear to have been separated for tens of thousands of years based on the genetics. And there's some recent evidence, in fact, that there may be another population that proves to be true. We call that a central stock and an Asian stock. And what unifies everything here to the left of the line is that all these populations have declined, and they all declined at roughly the same time, starting in the late 1970s. And in contrast to that, everything on the right side has been going up. And in recent years, it's been increasing exponentially, and we have a very, very different situation. And so in the United States, the western stock is declared endangered, and the other population, which is now larger than it's ever been known to be in history, is listed as a threatened species. The way we know, we talk about the logic of that later. It's a marine mammal. The other side of this is, how do we know how many sea lions are there? Well, in British Columbia, we fly planes like this and ask the pilot to turn them on their sides with a camera. And it's more sophisticated now in the United States with using belly-mounted planes, high-resolution images that can be blown up to almost get the point you count the whiskers on the muzzle of an animal. But the counts have been done essentially like this since 1956, when the first counts were done. And from this, you would shine it on a wall, at the time using slides, and use a pencil to put a dot on a piece of paper and count up all the dots. And that's how it's done. And today it's done on a computer screen, high resolution, counting a few more perhaps, but the technique hasn't really changed in almost 50 years. Here we have to account for, of course, the animals that are missing, because not every animal is on shore, and some are at sea at the time that the counts are done. But out of this, we come up with a correction factor, apply to the counts, and smooth out how many was there. And that's what I've done here. And to give you a sense of what happened to the western stock, this is going from about Prince William Sound westward to the end of the Aleutian Islands. And the first counts were done in 1956. And based on the limited counts, it appears that the population increased from about 225,000 animals, increasing and peaking in the early 1970s, and then began this roller coaster nosedive, with an inflection point in 1989, and a second one around 1999. And today, overall, the population would be considered stable, although within that category of stabilization, we have actually slight increases in the Gulf of Alaska, but still significant declines in the far western Aleutians. So they're not out of the woods completely, but there's indications of some sign of perhaps not recovery, but certainly turning in the right direction. If I plotted up the eastern stock, we find, in fact, it now exceeds the size of the western stock, and it's still growing. And again, to put this decline of sea lions into context, I want to plot up here some data of some of the other species that also declined. This is showing you proportional counts here done at Kagedic Island and near Kodiak of harbor seals. You see they too appear to have done a nosedive, also in the late 1970s, and were signs of some recovery. These are northern fur seal pups on St. Paul Island in the middle of the Bering Sea. And you see they also seem to decline at about the same time, stabilized, and are now in a very, very rapid decline. And that's not understood. And here we're overlaying some counts of sea lions in the eastern Aleutian Islands. And so you can see that it wasn't just the sea lions decline, it's many of these other species as well. If we come further south to British Columbia, and this would also reflect largely what's gone on in southeast Alaska, you'll see that the trends were opposite. Harbor seals increased. We now, in the Puget Sound area, and George Sugar have the highest density of harbor seals in the entire world. Increases in sea otters, increases in Steller sea lions. And if I plot the more recent data, we'd be off the scale right now. In fact, we've had in the last 2 years 2 new rookery start in British Columbia and 2 new that are on the way to reaching rookery status. That's going from 3 now to 5, and looks like we'll have 7 within the next 5 years. So here's the million-dollar question of why. Why are we seeing these opposite trends? Why do things decline in Alaska? And like anybody seeking funding, you can come up with lots of reasons why they decline. And with all the millions of dollars put out, people have studied every one of these things on here. And at the end of the day, though, it comes down to a couple of key ones that are still on the table. And I'm going to take you through what piece of evidence we have to sort of which ones are the most likely and which ones aren't. We've got 4 clues. And so when I started in the early 90s, this was the information we had. The first was information about body size. And it turned out that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game had shot a sample of animals in the 1970s, because that's what biologists did at that time, is you shot your animals, dissected, looked at stomach content, reproductive tracts, and in the 1980s they did the same thing again. And it was at a time when I don't think they even realized the population was declining. But in hindsight, going back to compare these 2 data sets, they discovered that the animals in the 1970s, the growth curves were physically bigger than animals in the 1980s. So there appeared to have been a stunting of growth that correlates with the decline of sea lions. Look at the reproductive tracts of these 2 samples. One of the curious things they noticed was, as you sampled animals going from December, January, February, March, I probably should have put a warning with this photo. We're discovering a lot of aborted fetuses, very healthy looking, just like this one, occurring in the wintertime. And they had noticed at this time that when you look at the reproductive tracts, that as you went closer and closer to the time of pupping, that fewer of the animals were still pregnant. So a 30 to 40% reproductive failure. And that appeared to be constant in both time periods. But the most intriguing thing is that animals in the 1980s that were nursing a pup, they had lower pregnancy rates. And so, again, perhaps they're having trouble maintaining, producing milk, and therefore aborting the fetuses. But that's what we have for evidence. So the third piece was when you look at the age structures of the 2 samples, what was noticed is that the animals in the 1980s, that largely the young animals were missing. And there were fewer of them. And so the hypothesis put forward that there was a high mortality, that something had removed it. And so out of that, then there is the hypothesis that juvenile mortality was high or juvenile survival was low. The 4th piece comes for diet. And what I've shown across here, starting, and again, this is starting at the time when I first got into this, is that the information we had in the 90s, this is frequency of occurrence, such that presence or absence in this time was fecal samples. You can see that 85% of the diet was gadids, which would be primarily cod and pollock. Flatfish made up about 13%. And at the far right is what I call the pelagics. These were things like capelin and sand lance. Things we think of being the small, schooling, oily fishes. But the curious thing is if you look back in time, and here I'm going to take you back in time with the gadids, what you see as we come down here is it goes from 85% down to 60, down to 32, to few. In fact, pollock and cod were very rarely seen in the 50s and 60s. And in this case, it was in the stomachs of animals that were shot. Flatfish, we see the similar pattern here from something that was more prevalent in recent times to something that wasn't reported at all in the past. And the reverse, though, is looking at the pelagics. So that is, at the time the population was healthy, is what was mostly in the diets. So those are the 4 clues, and we come back to this and say, so what is it? And I think most people picked up, well, there's something going on with the food, and the most likely explanation is something to do with fishing. And so the theory would be fishing has removed the key prey, animals have gotten smaller, they can't produce enough milk, they're aborting fetuses, young animals are starving. So that's what we set out to test. But along the way, we started to pick up information about other changes in the ecosystem, notably things connected to regime shifts. I know a lot of people here at UW have looked into these sorts of questions, but there seem to be some linkages to, for example, that change in diet. Why are they eating so much gadids today? Yes, there's a big fishery on it, but maybe something changed in the ecosystem. The other 2 things that have been on the table, one is predators, the role of killer whales particularly, though there was a period of time rich in sharks. And then more recently, there was this commercial whaling hypothesis. And I'll just touch on that very briefly as I go through. I'm not going to touch on the other things. I say they're basically off the table. But these are essentially the 3 major ones I want to focus on. So nutritional stress. The word is bandied about and tossed about, and for most people, when they hear the word nutritional stress, they think of starving animals, they think of El Nino type effects in the southern hemisphere, rib showing, and we think of that being related to overfishing. And the major species that are caught, the bulk of it is groundfish in the areas where the sea lions have been declining. And in the Gulf and Bering Sea, primarily walleye pollock, Pacific cod, and as you go further west, cod, and mostly African mackerel in the western Aleutians. So those are the three species I'll just focus on here. And the theory goes, if you put it back to those four clues, well, there must be fewer fish to eat. The fishing probably caused the fish to go deeper, making it harder for the sea lions to capture them, particularly young animals. Sea lions must be malnourished, and the juveniles are dying when they're weaning in the wintertime. And the sea lions probably need to roe and fish with pollock was another hypothesis. So all these things were put together and stated almost like facts because it fit some of the ideas we had about how we thought the world worked. And as a result of this, there were regulations put into place to try to move fishing further away from where sea lions were breeding, to move fishing over time. So you spread out the fishing season so it was less of a pulse effect. But the thing is that all these regulations, they weren't based on data. They're based on these assumptions. And as I'll show you, most of these assumptions are all false. But that's what we started from, and that's what the regulations were based on. One of the, in fact, the very first analysis I did, and we wrote up in 1992 with Peter Larkin, was to correlate the amounts of fish caught to the locations, and also look at sea lion population size and rates of change. And also even looked into trying to estimate the numbers of guns and shooting and other effects. Anyway, I didn't find anything that made any sense. In fact, it looked as though where sea lions should be most heavily impacted, based on information we had about diets and the dislike in many fishermen with sea lions, is that Southeast Alaska should have been the most impacted, and the least impacted, whereas the least human activity was in the western Aleutians. Yet we found the exact reverse. So I couldn't find anything. In fact, out of these 6 analyses, and my grad student, Tabitha Curie, is doing another analysis right now, we haven't been able to find anything that makes any sense. If there's a pattern there, it hasn't come forward. In fact, out of these 6, only one person has found a correlation, which is Dan Hennon. And his correlation essentially is tied into the time that the regulations were put into effect, 1989 and 1999. If you remember, the declining curve I showed, those were the 2 inflection points in the rates of change of sea lion numbers. And unfortunately, when regulations were put into place, they were put into place the very same years that we had those minor regime shifts. And so it's confounded. There are no controls. And so one might think there's human actions. I think actually environment is what really underlies this. So what should have happened, of course, is they should have read maybe the textbook by Carl Walters or others. About, you need to apply some adaptive management principles. So you can actually learn, you're going to do a fishery management action, let's gather some data to see if it's actually effective. And of course, there was a one-size-fits-all attitude. We don't do experiments with endangered species, was another one. And as a result, I think that absolutely nothing's been learned through fishing management to know whether or not it did or did not have an effect. And just to address briefly here about, are the stocks depleted, are they overfished? Because certainly a lot of literature reading about most fish in the world indicates that's been a pattern. But from Alaska, things I think have been managed differently. I just want to touch quickly here about the Marine Stewardship Council and their method of trying to independently assess fisheries and using their product label system to reward those they feel are environmentally responsible. And fisheries in Alaska have been certified of the salmon, pollock in the Gulf of Alaska, pollock in the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea, and Pacific cod fishery in the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea. This may well have been updated since I put this slide together. So certainly from some of the independent assessments, there appears to be, pollock seems to be, and cod in relatively good shape in terms of how it's managed. And so I think one can fairly argue there's been no global stock reduction. The question comes, though, what about on the scale that sea lions feed? Could there be localized depletion? And this is something that's very difficult to answer outright, except I think you can point to and say, well, given how fisheries have been pushed much further away, and also from what we now know about how close sea lions appear to be to land on average, it seems unlikely that there has been a localized depletion effect. But nevertheless, it's not impossible to test it. This is a map showing you the critical habitat areas. I just outlined in red, looking across here. And that's what is the official designated critical habitat for Steller sea lions. And most of the management actions are based on that. And unfortunately, it wasn't drawn with a whole lot of data back in the 90s. And what I've overlaid there is, in fact, the colors of some modeling work that I did with Ed Gregors. We tried to incorporate information about sea lion feeding behavior and come up with something that isn't a hard, fast boundary, but looks more at the probability distribution of sea lions based on densities and based on bottom depth that they typically feed at, and distributions from land. So we're showing there an alternative. You can see some areas on there from our model would indicate probably aren't used by sea lions that are protected, and other areas that our models would say probably should be more generous in protection than what the current regulations are. Overall, it appears the adult females do feed close to the shore, and the juveniles stay even closer. Many of the juveniles are waiting for mom to come back to feed them, and so there's little need for them to be going out to sea with their mothers if they're not feeding themselves. We did an experiment. I keep animals at the Vancouver Aquarium. I have a lab there. And also we have one set up in a place called Port Moody. It's the end of a fjord, and we have free-swimming animals. We have 5 animals based out there. And this is one of the experiments we did, which was partly to test the assumption at the time that fish were now deeper, and young animals couldn't get down to eat them. And so what we did is we took our animals out to this fjord that's very, very deep. And we set up here, we have a boat, and then that carries our metabolic equipment, and actually measure oxygen exchange, and determine how much energy it costs them to feed on fish, or to dive rather. We have this diving platform and a cage. The animal comes in where we can actually sample the air. And the animals then are then trained to dive down to the end of the feeding tube that we can place at different depths. And we actually are sending fish out at different rates, trying to simulate schools of fish. And we set up sometimes 2 tubes at different depths, basically trying to get into the head of the sea lion, to figure out how do they make their decisions. But the interesting thing in doing this experiment is that we discovered that it actually costs the sea lion more energy to go on these deep dives. And it was, I didn't quite expect that when the postdoc came back and said, no, this is what it is. It turns out because they have to fight, it's like putting a cork in a glass of water. You're trying to push it down and it's trying to float back to the surface, but the deeper it goes, essentially there's no longer any effective positive buoyancy, and will just drop like a rock. And so they actually spend more energy trying to stay in shallow depths than they do going down to deep depths. And what we concluded too by using feeding tubes at different depths and different rates is the animals have very flexible, very adaptive foraging strategies, such that as long as prey are present, it seems very unlikely that sea lions can have any difficulty in capturing them. In terms of malnourished animals, nobody, and we've now spent, I don't know how many thousand hours with different groups out looking at sea lions, and nobody has reported any starving animals. And I know from the studies that we do at the Vancouver Aquarium, where we actually manipulate food, we can recognize very, very quickly when an animal's getting less than adequate food, because you see the hips showing through, you see the ribs. Subtle things that occur far before starvation. But nobody has yet reported any sign in the declining area of starving or malnourished animals, which is what we were expecting to see. But the other side of this nutritional stress, which again most people think of as just being animals that can't get enough to eat, fishing, is the possibility, in fact, that there's an overabundance of fish that they're preying upon. And for a lot of people, when they first hear this, it's counterintuitive. It doesn't quite make sense. I mean, how could a population be declining in a sea of plenty? And it's been termed the junk food hypothesis, and I regret in hindsight that we didn't choose a better name for it. I wish, in fact, we called it the neutral light hypothesis. Because when you or I talk about junk food, you think of high-calorie food that makes us fat and unhealthy, but for a sea lion, junk food is the opposite. It's actually lean fish. It's the white flesh fish. It doesn't contain much fat, but it's high in protein. And so the theory goes, there's too many low-energy prey caught in pollock in the ecosystem and effectively in their diets, and not enough of the fatty fish, things like sand ants and herring. And to put on a human spin, it's basically saying, so we get sea lions living in a field of celery. And perhaps then you sort of get the idea that there are some types of food that we can actually eat in abundance and effectively not get all the nutrition that we need. And I'll talk more on that in just a second. So a lot of the studies then trying to sort out the different hypotheses been based on trying to compare across the line. So British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, sea lions are healthy, abundant, increasing. What's different? What makes them go up compared to the Gulf of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands? And so one way is you go and collect their fecal samples, and any volunteers? And most of them aren't quite as aggressive as this. And we can look at the diets primarily, but we're also now looking at things like hormones and also DNA work as well. So again, quite a bit of information that way. We've done behavioral observations. I've had a number of graduate students out, sometimes in the winter, spring, summer. We've had some sites occupied for a full year, trying to document aspects of their lives that we didn't know before. In fact, things that we assumed, went to test, and turned out were wrong. And there's been a number of studies, some that we've been involved with, but more done so by National Fisheries Service and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in tracking animals at sea and trying to understand how long they go on the feeding trips and what condition they are as well. So there were a number of assumptions made about what we'd expect under an overfishing hypothesis. And these were the two primary ones. First is, we know, and these are based on what we've seen, particularly with South American sea lions and South American fur seals, that during El Nino years when the prey are gone, those animals go on very long feeding trips looking for prey, and the populations decline. And when times are good, lots of food, they go on short feeding trips. In terms of the weights of their pups, where populations decline, moms and dads often abandons their pups, but the pups are light and scrawny, and with the population healthy, they're big and fat. Nothing surprising there. So this was in the, now taking the late 90s, this is what we went out to test. We're all quite convinced it would be very easy to show this and show the fact that prey was missing. And so the studies, unfortunately, were only done at a few sites, but we had behavioral observations set up at 2 prime sites. There were animals captured and instrumented and sent out, and pups were weighed at different sites as well. And so here was one of the studies, and the results were here. This is using telemetry and with a small number of animals, but it was possible to measure the stomach temperature to know what animals had actually followed prey. And so in the very first one there, you can see we expected long feeding trips. The trips are in fact 7.5 hours on average, and where we expected the trips to be short, increased population, they were almost 40 hours long. In terms of the first feeding event, measured by this drop in stomach temperature when they swallowed their first fish, less than an hour where the population was declining, and almost 5 hours to find the first fish. Not what we expected, flawed experiment. The behavioral observations where we could actually record the feeding trip lengths of marked females, we found the same thing. Short trips on the declining population, long trips on the increasing one. And so the instrumentation as well as behavioral observations saw the same thing, not what we expected. But what about pup weights? Exact opposite again. And so the simple explanation here is that in the declining areas here, pollock was a major part of their diet. A very high abundance of it. The females were finding lots of it. Short trips, coming back, producing lots of milk for the pups, and getting nice big fat pups. The increasing population, on the other hand, their diet has some pollock in it, but mostly sand ants, herring, salmon, and rich fish, but apparently less of it overall, so it took them longer to find it, and therefore spent less time nursing their pups and produced lighter pups. That's probably the explanation for what we're seeing. We're starting to find any indication of a shortage of prey in the declining area. When you look at their diets, it's true that sea lions eat probably over 100 different species, but these seem to be consistently in their top 10 or 11 species: herring, sandlance, capelin, smelt, salmon, flatfish, cod, pollock, rockfish, actomar, octopus, squid, and sculpins. And probably most people will sample most of these species, except perhaps the sculpins, unless you're Aleutians and they're going to make a great soup with them. But for the most part, they're eating species that humans also would eat. I'm going to show you that there's a bit more structure to some of these declines and maybe what that overall smooth curve might indicate. And this map here is showing you the distribution here of the rookeries in the Gulf and Aleutians. And what I'm going to do is show you here some of the population trends. We're showing here lambda. And this is through the 1990s. And essentially, anything that's above this line here, lambda 1, would be the population rookery that increased during the 1990s. And anything below are those that decreased. But you can see that there are some that were almost at a break-even point during the 90s, and others that were in quite severe decline. And below, I'm just going to put an indication of what the size was, the mean size of those populations. And that scale goes down to 1,500 as a max. But the point of it is to see that there are probably two core areas here. You have both large sea lion populations and rates of decline that were either slightly negative or slightly positive. And the interesting thing is that there's metapopulation structure through here, as others have pointed out. And when you compare here to the diets, and I'll show you here some summer and winter diet with more detail than you want to look at right now, but there's also a structure here in the diets that seems to line up with some of the changes in population size. So essentially there's clusters of species that seem to group together and show up consistently in the fecal samples you've been collected. And when you look back here, you can see that some of these species clusters seem to tie with some of the major passes through the Aleutians. And probably there's a lot of oceanography that explains why some species are where they are, why they show up in the diets of the sea lions. Grouped here is just to show that African mackerel is the primary prey species. Everything west of Samalka Pass and everything here to the east is primarily cod and pollock, primarily pollock. But the point is that Samalka Pass is one of those major dividing lines in the highway. And there's also been similar strong differential between the types of seabirds on each side of this line as well. One of the earlier studies that gave a lot of credibility to diet as being a big factor was published by Dick Merrick as part of his original PhD thesis. And what he did was to plot on the y-axis the rate of change of the sea lion populations, and on the x-axis the diversity of the diet. So he took these different species of prey and grouped them into 7 categories. So if a sea lion ate from all 7 food groups, it would have an index of 7. If it ate from only one of the 7, it had a value of 1. And when he plotted these up for the different areas, he came up with a fairly nice correlation. We went out to test his theory that there is something to do that the more diverse your diet was, the better your state was, and those with the least diverse diets declined the most. So in Southeast Alaska, where the population had a positive increase, we calculated the other diet diversity and found a point up here that added a lot of credibility to the more diverse your diet was, the better off you were. And of course, you have to think about what's the mechanism here. Is it just diversity or something else? So we went one step further and we tried to calculate the energy content of the diet and work out how much food the animals would need. And so here we have the same y-axis, but here from one of our bioenergetic models, we worked out, based on the diets, how much food do the sea lions have to eat in each of these regions. And what you'll see as we draw the regression here is it's the opposite. That sea lions in Southeast Alaska, shown in the red dot on the left, are eating about 16 kilograms of food per day on average, and the right with a decline, they have to eat more, about 20 kilos per day. And so probably the explanation for this diet diversity is really tied back to energy content of prey, and this ties back to stomach capacities. The reason the animals in Southeast need to eat less is because there's more energy in their food. While those in the far west have to eat more because they're getting fewer calories out of the meat or fish. Another thing we looked at in more detail was more specific here about diets between the two areas. And this is showing you here out of the Gulf, where we have some early diet information and this rate of population decline. And what I wanted to do was to compare it to British Columbia where we're seeing this very rapid rise in sea lion numbers. And so the limited data we have indicates that back in the 50s, smelt and kefta made up about close to 50% of the diet, and it's not reported now. I'm joining the lines on here not to indicate there's a linear decline, but just to draw your attention to 2 points in time. We see the same thing with kelp greenlings, and as we come across here, the cod, flatfish, herring, sandlance, salmon, and here's the big change here. So increases in salmon and walleye pollock. This is a summertime diet. And this is where the population declined. What about in British Columbia? Our population was really low, and we know it's low in part because of culling. But the fact is that after culling stopped, the population didn't increase. It took an awfully long time. So what were they eating when the population was low? It turns out they're eating rockfish, which declined more recently, and walleye pollock used to be a big part of the diet of the low population. And now it's very rarely found in the diet of sea lions in BC. Flatfish, dogfish, salmon, pig, and here's what really changed. Lots of sandlance and lots of herring. And so it's consistent that it seems that the high populations are eating fattier fishes, and the populations are low, they're eating more of the pollock or cod. And some of the stories about this change also line up with some of the stories told by fishermen. If you remember being up at meetings in Kodiak, and we told, in the 60s, catching lots of shrimp, and seeing this change, the codfish came in, and now essentially virtually a whitefish with flatfish, cod and pollock being the dominant prey. It's also interesting to compare some of the traditional knowledge. And this is one of the quotes that really caught my attention, which published in 1961 by an anthropologist, and she wrote, "Cod were almost unknown until the sea lion herds diminished in 1873. Now they're very common. The Attica mackerel was unknown after before 1875 when it appeared unexpectedly. The natives say that it drove the sea lions away." And so the point of this, and there's other quotes and other things from other sources that point out that this is not the first time the sea lions have declined. There was a period in the 1870s, which was the most recent decline. And also it's interesting to see that cod and Attica mackerel appear to also have changed in abundance quite dramatically. And working with anthropologists, or archaeologists rather, also come up with information, looking at some of the middens in Alaska, and picking up that sea lions and gadids, in periods of time when they've been more abundant than today, also periods of time when they've been less abundant. And I think this is an important perspective, is to keep in mind that our view of time is very limited. Our lifetimes are short, and if you go back into history, realize that some of the events we're seeing today have occurred in the past. The challenge, of course, is trying to sort out what is natural to what has the compounded effect of human actions on top of it. I'm just going to talk about some of the other captive work we've done, at this case at the Vancouver Aquarium, and we currently have, I think, 4 or 5 animals there, plus another population of fur seals that we're doing studies with. And it really is trying to understand what is the effects of changes in diet. This was a study we published in 2000, effectively called Testing the Junk Food Hypothesis. And what we did is we had young sea lions, or about 3 years of age at the time, and we were feeding them herring, and we let them eat as much as they wanted. They were eating about 5% of the body weight per day. We switched them then for about 2 weeks onto pollock, and there they're consuming about 5.5% per day of the body weight. And then we flipped them back on the herring, and you can see the increase in consumption just slightly. So overall, it looks like not a huge change in consumption, they just like rise over time. What happened to their body weights? On herring, they were gaining about 0.2 kilos per day, but while they're on this all-you-can-eat pollock, they were losing weight, about 0.5 kilos per day. In fact, our vet asked us to stop the experiment. He said it was unethical to be doing this. And we did have some safety cutoffs, but the strange thing is that the animals were not eating more to make up for this. Come back on the herring and it was growing. So this was the first experimental evidence that there really was something to this junk food hypothesis. And so we've done other things. We've looked at simulation efficiencies, the heat implemented feeding, digestive efficiency associated with the size of fish. And when you put it all together, it turns out that comparably to herring, see them having somewhere between 35 to 80% more polish than herring to get the same amount of energy out of it. And in terms of the roe-bearing fish, which is one of the assumptions that are important, it turns out once we got samples from different months, we discovered the worst thing we could have fed our fish would have been the roll-bearing ones. They had very little energy left in them. The best fish that we used in our experiment turned out to be the ones from the fall, because the fish had been feeding all summer. They basically stored what they've got, and they're going to be using that energy through the rest of the winter into spring. And so we actually were feeding them with the most energy possible in the fall. We did some other modeling work looking at how much food, again, does the sea lion need. And so for a 6-year-old, it needs about 7% of its body weight per day. It turns out to be probably the most energetically expensive input. The phocids would need only about half that, so the harbor seals, for example, compared to what a sea lion needs, or Steller sea lion in this case. If you have a 1-year-old animal, it turns out it needs about twice the energy of what the adult needs, about 14% of its body weight. So we set up another experiment, which we call the Sea Lion All-You-Can-Eat Buffet Study. And we basically put food out because one of the criticisms of the earlier study was maybe that was a handling effect, because we had trainers offering as much fish as they wanted, and perhaps there was some sort of psychology going on. So we set up another study where we put these feeding trays out, and we set up an experiment with low-energy fish and high-energy fish. They gave it the option every day or every second day based on eating behavior of animals in the wild. And what we discovered from this is that sea lions can actually get full before they've eaten enough. And this seems to be a big surprise to a lot of people in the marine mammal field, that animals might get full. You don't think twice for humans, you know yourself, there's limit how much you can eat. It turns out for sea lions the same thing. And so we discovered that the maximum consumption was 16 to 18% of their body weight. Remember, our model says that on an average diet they need about 14%. It turns out that if you only offer them gathers, that our animals in this study were actually ate the maximum and could not consume more. They were physically limited, they couldn't process anymore, and were losing weight on this. So it turns out that on the low energy fish, they would have to be consuming, in this study case, it was closer to 25 to 30% of their body weight, and it just was not physically possible to do that. And the moral here is that all fish are not created equal. And for a sea lion or for marine mammals, some prey are nutrition is better than others. And again, it's not commonly recognized. So for the juveniles then, energetically, they're living on the edge. And it seems that, in this case here, that should they wean too early, they may well end up with stunted growth. That may delay their age at first birth, increase the risk of disease and predation. And it appears from other work we've done that the way to avoid this is you stick with your mom for an extra 2 or 3 years, because the adults have the stomach capacity. They're not limited when the young animals are. Young animals need energy to grow. That's the most expensive part of living. And the adults who finish growing can actually increase the consumption and do perfectly well, but the young animals cannot. Trying to understand a bit more about why it is that there appears to be so much gavids in the sea lion diet. And this ties back, I believe, to the Pacific, sort of to ocean climate, and I'm using here Pacific gill oscillation sort of make the point that has looked back at this time period over the past 100 years. There have been major shifts here from what I think we can loosely refer to warm periods to cold and back to warm. And the interesting thing with the sea lion data is we've only ever looked at it in 2 periods. We started studying sea lions when they were high, and we're studying them in a period of low. And we have to keep in context that where the starting point was. This is where the marine mammal data is from. The first point was 1956. As a result, that has become a reference point. And that's where we think sea lions need to get back to, without recognizing that probably they've been shifting in abundance for a long time. In fact, it was interesting, I met a woman who grew up on Marmot Island, and she grew up through the 30s and 40s, and stayed on, and she recalled the time there were just no sea lions there. And that as time went on in the 50s, sea lions began breeding there, and they were no longer able to use the beaches. And so there are some human stories as well that match up with some of the periods of time we don't have data. What's the mechanism? One possibility is that in the cold period that a lot of the farmer production stays up, and we support a species here in the upper or the water column, and during the cold period, it may well be transferred down to other species. And so that's one possible mechanism, and there's a large study being funded through NPRD focused on testing some of these hypotheses. about warm versus cold, and trying to understand the mechanisms that drive the ecosystem. I think some of this will ultimately tie into understanding what happened to Steller sea lions. Killer whales, what role have they played? I think they have played a significant role, but not in the way you might think. The evidence we have from commercial whaling, at least as myself and others have tried to evaluate it, is it's a fascinating hypothesis, but it just doesn't match up with what we know and with other areas. So we know about killer whales, their diets, their predatory habits, and when we look elsewhere in the world, there's similar levels of whaling occur. We didn't see any sorts of things similar to this. So I don't think that hypothesis is supported, but it doesn't rule out the fact that killer whales can still be very important in the system. And to make that point, I'm going to show you an ecosystem model that Steller was in charge of putting together. We did it here for the Aleutian Islands. And what we're trying to do was essentially fit some smooth counts here of Stellers here through the 60s out to 2000. And we want to look at these different factors: fishing, killer whales, large flatfish, and also put an environmental factor, and essentially drove them all using the inverse of the PDO. And so putting all these factors together, we're able to, not surprisingly, end up with a good fit. And then the interesting exercise was to come back now and remove each of these factors from the model to see how we change the predictions. So for example, if you remove large flatfish, you discover that you don't see much change until the very tail end of this, suggesting that if there were no flatfish in the system, there might be slightly more sea lions. Remove fishing, and again, see nothing here in terms of driver decline, but suggestions that maybe something might be different at the tail end. Killer whales, again, not driving decline, but suggesting that could have a much bigger effect here at the end. And finally, the major driving force behind this, as we put in, turned out, at least what disrupted the pattern here is, in this case here, using the PDO as the driving force behind it. So it appears then from this model, the conclusion we've drawn is that ocean climate appears to be the major driving force, but as you get to, and not predation, as you get to the tail end, it looks as though little predation can have quite a large effect on small populations. I think that makes good sense. It's equated to your mortgage, that you've got a nice big healthy mortgage. At the beginning of it, you can be paying off the interest payments, and you're not touching your principal at all. When you get down to the tail end, it's something that has a big impact on it. And so it looks as though predation probably has the biggest effect on small populations, but not on large populations. And the other point I want to make with this is that the rates of predation probably vary by region of Alaska. And there have been some areas, particularly in the Prince William Sound and Kodiak area, there seems to be 5 whales that have specialized on Steller sea lions. But elsewhere, there appear to be other species. And sea lions don't appear to be a big part of their diets. So how does it all work? Let me try to put the pieces together. And I think to do this, you need to almost think as an evolutionary biologist and think about some of the basic biology of sea lions. But of course, in thinking about the biology, it's also important to rethink through some of the things we used to think about how sea lion biology functioned over life history. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, originally, when I first started, in fact, my first student here, Boyd Porter, we sent him out in November and December to document weaning sea lions that were starving. That's what all the sea lion biologists at the time had led me to believe. That was the thought. And so Boyd went out, and the only one who lost weight that much, it was him. He didn't see a single sea lion weaning. We observed a few things. One was that we saw sea lions catching fish, young sea lions here, pups or yearlings, playing with fish, but we never saw any of them actually swallow them. And we also saw starving pups on the shore that were trying to steal milk from other females. And I thought at the time that was kind of strange. Why don't they just go and eat fish? Because it's clear they can catch it, but they weren't doing it. And the other part of that is when we brought sea lion pups in the first time to Vancouver Aquarium, I think it was around 1994, the first group, and again, based on the wisdom, decided, okay, it was January 1st, this is when they weaned in the wild. That's when we took them all off the milk bottles, we put live fish in with them, they killed the fish, they played with them, there's nothing but a skeleton and flesh in the tank. They wouldn't swallow any. We then tried to force feed them, and they were not allowed, they wouldn't swallow it. They had some kind of a gag reflex to prevent them from swallowing. So finally, we had to put it in, clamp their mouth shut, massage their throats, and wait and wait and wait until they voluntarily swallowed it. And so there's something here, and we now understand that, in fact, at this age, if any of these animals start to eat fish, it's the kiss of death. They're not going to make it. It's milk or nothing. And I think that they evolved to do this. Second part I put up here is that the thinking was that the animals only breed at rookeries. And it turns out that that's actually wrong. And we picked up on this because we kept trying to figure out when do they wean. And one of the things we noticed on here was this is summertime, and you see these bulls holding territories. And some of the bulls have got harems and females around them. And what we noticed is that, in fact, they are protecting breeding areas. And while the pups aren't born at these non-breeding sites, the males are actually populating with all the females that are there. There's a lot of sex going on at these sites. So it appears then that all the females are getting pregnant every year, whether or not they go back to give birth, or whether or not they stay with their juveniles, or in some cases not pregnant at all, or with no pups at these sites. And so in the end, we've got about 88 rookeries. There's about 600 hollows, and many of these are probably central to the survival of the species because they're prime breeding areas, although not nursing or pupping areas. And the other interesting is looking at reproductive failure. A number of biologists, myself included, have noted, found fetuses. I showed you a photo of one that we found one winter. And so at this one site in Frederickson, where I had students out for a whole year, they were actually, one thing they started to do was count all the fetuses. And here's the site they were observing, and unfortunately, even though we knew there were a lot more abortions occurring, they only counted 8, January, February, and March. But the one thing that they were very astute at is that they noticed that the eagles were coming in. And I don't know how many of you ever had an eagle swoop down on them, but they are huge. And the eagles were coming in quite regularly and swooping down and clearing the hollow of all the animals and scaring them to the water. And so they were actually recording disturbances caused by eagles. And this was the pattern of disturbance. And what they noticed is also what the eagles were doing. And during this period here, they could see the eagles were actually ripping up something on the rocks. And it appears in a couple of cases, they could actually see them eating the fetuses that were noted. And so out of this, it appears that eagles are a good proxy for abortions. And you see the period is December, January, February, March. There's a second peak here in disturbance, and this was associated with a nest above the hollow, and eagles sometimes are swooping off that when up to clear the animals. It appears then that the eagles are quite dependent on eating the fetuses that are appearing during these months. But the interesting thing is that what we discovered from repeatedly going out is the animals aren't weaning in winter. They're actually weaning in June, almost when they're a full year old or full 2 years old. And when you look here in terms of the food consumption, this is actually a game for models, but the yellow line, first one, is showing you what is the food consumption for an animal that's non-pregnant. And you can see a fairly consistent pattern. The beginning part is really associated with growth, getting to adult size, and then fairly stable afterwards. But you can see the cost here we estimate for being pregnant is very little. You don't have to eat that much more food to maintain a fetus. But if you have a pup, it costs you about 70% more energy to have that pup. And so the strategy, I believe, for the sea lions is evolved that in the sea of gaddids that says, if you've been nursing a pup, if you wean it at 1 year, it's going to die. And if you go back, there's another pup, it too will die. And the way to make this happen is you actually keep the pup. You can abort the fetus, and as a result, mom is essentially supplementing or making up a change in energy poor quality codfish into energy-rich oceans. Until the pup is now big enough at age 2 or 3, it can now feed on its own because it now has a stomach capacity. It's got through the most critical growth period. So we discovered that weaning was occurring in summer and not winter, in about 1, 2, or 3 years old. And so I think then we have the strategy that has evolved through tens of thousands of years in the Pacific that has changed periodically. Everybody gets pregnant, you're going to abort and keep the pup when times are tough. And in this case, times are tough for the young, not for the adults. And that will effectively cut your birth rate by over 50%. And so I think one of the mistakes in the early years looking at age structure is that it wasn't that pups were dying. is that they weren't born. What about effect on body size? And this ties into the animals get smaller and bigger. And to do this, what I did is I found a student actually from Japan. We actually got sea lion skulls. We found 600 skulls from museums and collections around the world. And we went to measure them up to see if we could create growth curves for skulls. You might wonder how many ways can you measure a skull. I can count them for you. And what we wanted to do was to essentially look at before and after regime shift. And what we were expecting to find, based on the published paper showing difference in body size, that animals would get smaller. What we found, in fact, is that the animals got bigger. It wasn't the adults, though, no difference in adult size, but the juveniles actually got bigger after the population declined. They didn't get smaller. And I think the explanation for that is because they stayed with their mums in this field of pollock or cod, mom was producing more energy for them, growing them faster, and at which point they can wean and feed on it themselves. And so it turns out that earlier data is actually, I think, wrong. One other thing came out of the skulls is that from 597 skulls, we took 39 measurements and did a discriminant function analysis. And then we grouped them here. So the skulls that came from Asia compared to the ones from British Columbia to California, and another group here from Alaska. And so what we can see is that we're actually able to classify these skulls correctly based on these measurements, 74 to 92% of the time. So it adds credence to the view from the genetics, the fact that there are these three distinct units. And that was something that we hadn't expected to look for, but looked just out of curiosity, and to find a morphometric reason to see three distinct units. So finally here, let me just review the 4 clues. I think as we look back at the evidence, as we start adding in other diet information from unknown collection in British Columbia, we find evidence that diet did change over time. In terms of birth rates, again, all this data here seems consistent with both our current understanding of biology. So that fits. In terms of juvenile survival, I think that the data were misinterpreted at the time. And it was based on the idea that animals weaned every year, just like a fur seal does, or a harbor seal, and it didn't take into account the fact that animals, they have this delayed age of weaning. And so another way to interpret the data is that it's not that they had died, is that they weren't born. And you come up with simply mathematically the same. And since then, there's been a lot more modeling work done trying to fit different sorts of assumptions to the declines, and it appears to be sort of a combination, as you start to refine this, of mortality of young, delayed age of weaning, and also some effect, particularly in a very sharp period, of some mortality of adults. But it appears that the underlying thing probably has been nutritionally based, associated with weaning and reproduction. And finally, the body size story that was published, it doesn't work. At least not when we look at the skulls. And one of the things we're realizing going back to the original Gray reports is, I think one reason is that the animals in 1 year were measured belly up, and the next decade they were measured belly down. And actually, which way you measure an animal changes its size. And it turns out, because they never collected data for this purpose, they didn't have the same methods. And I think that's part of it. What we're going to try to do is actually match up some of the skulls with the animals that were measured, because I think in the end the bones don't lie. Those are very firm set measurements, unlike a lot of plasticity when you're trying to measure a freshly killed animal. So we're going to try to get to the bottom of that one. What about the evidence of overfishing? We haven't had any sign of starving animals, any sign of animals that can't find enough food. All the animals look to be very, very healthy that we're seeing in the declining areas. And there's just no evidence that they're having any difficulty in finding prey. In this case, referring to groundfish, which is the primary part of the diet where they decline. So I think then the evidence points here to regime shifts, causing some change in food. But the secondary factor of predation, now that the populations of sea lions are so low, I think in some areas, particularly in the eastern Gulf, we're probably doing some serious damage to recovery because we're seeing signs of the diet is improving there. So I think that they're now playing quite a large effect. So, final conclusion, in terms of what went on, the ecosystem has changed due to shifts in ocean climate, and it hasn't collapsed. I think it's happened repeatedly in the absence of humans. The decline of sea lions appears to be primarily due to reproductive failure and predation associated with this dominance of low-energy prey in their ecosystem. And in terms of the question I posed about groundfish fisheries and sea lions, can the two coexist? I think that the science indicates that sea lions can and are coexisting with groundfish fisheries. Unfortunately, science tends to be ignored or discounted if it doesn't agree with personal beliefs. But here I'm referring to the personal beliefs about how you and I think about how the world works. And I wouldn't have thought this to be true when I first started this, but what I've learned over the years is that the filter we use as scientists about what science we want to accept or don't is often based on our views about how we think the world actually works. In this case, a lot of views is that it's sort of based, I think, in a kind of a Garden of Eden view. The world was pristine until fisheries came. But looking back longer term, you can see that that just is not the case. So as a result, I think this coexistence is always going to be a very bumpy and contentious relationship. Thank you very much. Yeah, and that's a good point. And it's not just the large whales recovering, so particularly the humpback whales is one that people are now attuned to. There's also some recovery of fin whales in some areas. And they're consuming a lot of the lower production. And I guess part of the building, whether or not they're having an effect, is we're not very good yet at estimating the abundance of deposits or abundance of cobra ponds. And we can, though, get maybe some sense of the effect on herring populations in the case of humpback whales. But there's certainly a factor coming into play that people now are beginning to recognize that we need to account for that. The other factor are the large flatfish, particularly arrowtooth flounder. I know that's something that, and when my first insight this was in the late 90s, put together an ecopath model, and I was just so shocked to see that the trophic level of these large flatfish was up at a level very close to what the sea lions were. And so they share a very similar diet. So I think that's another factor that others haven't. I think more recently, I know George Hunt has picked up on that also with fur seals being a factor. So I think that both large flatfish and recovering whale populations are other things that can compound to recover some of these species.
And you've made a convincing argument, I think, about the whole the abortion of the pregnancy at some point. Probably in terms of that they're getting some environmental cues and therefore aborting, and then maybe cues that are very different to our own. Because we say like lots of fish, so clearly cueing as something else. But that really I would take from that it is a really long-term strategy, right? I mean, that's not something that happens very quickly in a couple of decades. It seems to be more an evolutionary strategy. It would seem to indicate that there's been large population fluctuations in the past before we have any information, and therefore, but we really don't have to worry about the population that much as we are, because we could interpret it that way. And the concern is more that what creates an uptick again, or what people call a lack of recovery, but maybe it's just what's going to cause an increase again in terms of the historic perspective, and whether that's another regime shift or something else. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, and I think, so let's say that I've got it right. Does that mean just open up all these closed areas to fishing? And that should not be the take-home message. Because the reality is, as we've talked about the effects of killer whale predation, that as the sea lion populations get low, they're actually at greater risk. And so I think one has to be more precautionary as you get down to lower levels and do some assessment. Although even in the more recent work, I know I did a population viability analysis a few years ago, and things are looking good, and the more recent analysis done using more recent data suggests a lot of stability, giving a lot more confidence. So one thing is to be aware that at low levels, there's greater risk of things happening. The other thing maybe just to touch on briefly is the question about this abortion and how did it evolve. And originally my thinking was, well, it must be tied into animals that are nursing, that this pressure of lactation somehow makes the female abort. Except that there's no sign, the abortion occurred in December, January, February. They're probably not starting any fish at all, the young ones, until maybe the earliest might be April or May. And so what's the mechanism here? And I think part of it might be when we were feeding our animals at the aquarium, we could actually feed an animal either pollock or herring, two animals that looked on the outside to be physically identical, both looking rotund, robust. But if you actually looked at the composition, the one that ate pollock only had a little bit of fat on it. There's almost all lean tissue. And the one that was eating herring was carrying an awful lot of fat, although to the outside, to our eye, they looked identical. And I think that there's something there. So probably the female's already sensed the environment, and so it's probably a function of how much lipid fat she's carrying, combined with the pressure of nursing. And so I think there's probably a hormonal change that's causing it. So I've been consulting now with some of the prenatal specialists at the hospital in Vancouver, trying to see if there's any indication in the human literature or anything else that might butt in. But to me, this is one of the missing gaps. I don't know if we've ever tested experimentally. I'm sure there would be no animal ethics committee that will let you do it. But I think that's another piece here to fill in. But I suspect that those females, if this is the mechanism, it's their young that would have reproduced later on and survived. And those that kept trying to put a pup each year, those pups died. So the genes were passed on. So I think that they have evolved. You have to ask yourself, why do sea lions have this plasticity in the age of weaning? There has to be some adaptive function there. And I think that helps to shape fish look back and the historic record and making sense. So I think all the pieces come together and collectively it all makes sense.
But the eastern DPS is showing a very, very dramatic increase. And yet, we don't think that the fish communities, at least between the eastern and western Gulf of Alaska, are that different.
There is a big difference. Because if we look at the diets, there's nowhere near as much pollock. We're finding, for example, let me just take British Cod as an example, a huge amount of sardines in the diet of the animals, lots of herring, lots of salmon. The diets really have been night and day between the areas. Although more recently, there's been a shift in the diet in the Kodiak region, and with the species coming into that system, some which have not been seen in quite a while at the balances. But I think that there are shifts there occurring. You don't seem convinced.
Well, the sardines, for instance, I was thinking about sardines.
Yeah.
It's one major change that actually sort of parallels that, but they're still seasonal.
They are, but other things like sand lance and herring are less seasonal. Salmon, for example, is very seasonal. But there are some species, and the gaddis tend to be more wintertime. Skates, another one that show very dominant in the wintertime. But the diets of the sea lions are very remarkable between the regions. And I have to assume that those are reflecting some indication of what the animals are sampling and for what is there for them to eat. Maybe the back.
I was wondering if you did any experiments with prey choice in the aquarium. Like, do they prefer herring over cod, or?
Yeah, I had an honor student, and we tried to test that. And so we had a box where the door opens up, and we had on one side, the first piece we used squid, herring, salmon, and pollock. And essentially, and we did it two ways. One was, and the size of the fish, of course, were different. And so essentially, they only gave a choice of 1-to-1. They would choose big over small. So it was salmon, pollock, herring, squid. But if you put up equal weights, so it would be the same relative amounts, they were choosing salmon, herring, pollock, squid. In fact, none of the animals like eating squid. Maybe one animal just refused to take part in it. But I'm not sure it's really valid, and so we never went any further with it. But when we did do that simple choice experiment, that's what we're seeing.
Speaking of squid, have you seen an increase in squid in the diet? Can you comment on the metabolic costs of digesting squid?
Squid isn't a huge part of the diet of sea lions. Octopus seems to be a bigger component. And For example, for first seal squid is much more important, for some of the cetaceans as well. In terms of the energetic cost to digest it, it turns out that it's difficult for them to digest. Maybe they get a lot of water out of it, but energetically they're not getting as much. And it's actually the fatter fish are easier to digest than the leaner species. And so they lose twice. They get fewer calories, plus they have to burn more energy to digest it. So, yeah, not great.
I think actually on that note, we should conduct our own non-cruise hypothesis testing out in the lobby. I invite you to